And we are going to go ahead and get started this morning. Once again, a quick thank you to Chris Bucher for joining us in what is part 2 of a 3-part series. So I am going to turn things over to her at this time and say thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thanks. It's good to see everyone. Some of you I remember were on my screen last week. Others, I think maybe not. Last week I talked about the temple and understanding of the temple in first century Judaism and how that relates to the New Testament and to the Christian tradition. And I said it was my introduction. So I have a little introduction where I'm looking at you. And then I'm going to switch. I do have this week again, I have a some slides to show just because, there's information and definitions. And I thought it would be easier for you to catch that if you hear it from me and see it on your screens. But first, a little bit of introduction. The same thing I said last week applies to today and next week. I think for me, it's important. Truth is important. Historical truth is important. Historical accuracy, understanding the complexity of that concept of historical truth, and also relations between Jews and Christians, which other traditions have really focused on. I think the Lutheran tradition, I know that also the Catholic tradition have really worked at developing a better relationship between their traditions and Judaism. I think I'm not aware that our own tradition, Church of the Brethren or Anabaptist traditions have worked at that quite in the same way. And I think there are reasons for that, which I won't go into. But I think it's important, especially in the sort of production of and classes for children and youth. So I grew up fairly familiar in Mechanic Grove Church of the Brethren, fairly familiar with the New Testament. So I was familiar with the portrayal of the Pharisees in the New Testament, and I think I don't remember much more than that. I don't remember there being any Jewish families in my community or any Jewish students at my schools. So I was really isolated from the tradition of Judaism until I got into college and seminary and graduate school. And first of all, I took a couple of courses that really changed my view of Judaism, which was unformed probably or malformed at that point, really transformed my view of Judaism and my understanding of the New Testament and in its context of first century Judaism. And on the Pharisees, that was one of the sort of transformative moments when I discovered that from a Jewish perspective, the Pharisees were actually good guys. And this is debated today historically, but I remember learning from my teachers then, this was quite a while ago, that the Pharisaic tradition was really the origin of Rabbinic Judaism, and Rabbinic Judaism then led into the Judaism that we know of today, or Judaisms that we know of today. That view's, I think, been nuanced a little bit, but that was how I learned it. That it was really revered within the Jewish tradition. So a little bit of some of the points that I'm going to cover today, and then just an outline, and then I'll switch to share my screen so you can see my slides while I talk. So one, we really don't know much about historical Pharisees, the historical Pharisees, and that's really what I'll focus on today. Two, the Pharisees in the New Testament are really caricatures of the Pharisees or stereotypes. And I'll also say more about that. In Judaism, I'll repeat this, the Pharisees are respected and often related to rabbinic Judaism and therefore to modern Judaism. So for many Jews, they see the Pharisees as sort of part of the stream of their own tradition. And here's something came to me recently. I'll reference two books at the end of my slide presentation. One is a 2021 publication, and some of you may know the work of Amy Jill Levine on New Testament and Judaism. And I hadn't really thought about this before, but in her chapter in this book, she says that what is said negatively in the New Testament about Pharisees often gets generalized as negative characterizations of all Jews. So I added that to my list of what we should be aware of as we're looking at this topic. What I'll cover in the presentation, and I'll try to keep it, I'm going to keep my eye on the clock over here and no later than 9:40. So we have at least the last 20 minutes. And if I talk real fast, I might end a little earlier than that. I don't know, but I'll try to just be ready to stop at no later than 9:40 so that we do have time for questions and discussion. And if it worked well last week, if you have a question that occurs, to put it in the chat or write it down and ask it at the end. I think in this Zoom setting, that's probably going to work better than my trying to be aware of who's got a question or a comment. So put your question here in the chat, and I'll try to respond to that at the end. So the outline is, I'm going to look at some negative uses by Christians today. Not going to dwell on that, but give you some examples. Differences between what we know about the Pharisees, how they should be defined, and then how the term is actually used, not just by Christians, but just sort of common parlance. Then this is the major part of the presentation, sources that we have about the Pharisees and some summaries of bulleted lists. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. So that's where we're headed. And I'm going to share my screen now. And I always hope that I can find it. There we go.
Yeah, I see it, and I recognize the song.
Yeah. Okay. So this song was not around when I was a youth, but when my sons were youths, they came home with singing this, or somehow I became aware of it. Some of you may know it. I don't want to be a Pharisee because they're not fair, you see. And I remember that I, stopped them and said, "Where'd you learn that?" Let me tell you about the Pharisees. So there's one, and this is one that children get, the song, and it's a nice song, but it, I'm going to say it stereotypes Pharisees in an unfair way. Here's a, whoops, uh-oh. Why am I not? There we go. Here are 3 book titles. I didn't put the authors' names because I don't want to, you can find these, just do a Google search. But these are 3 books that I found online available. They're all published from 2000 and later, written by Christian authors, and they use the term Pharisee. They're not writing about the New Testament Pharisees or the historical Pharisees. They're using the term Pharisee and the characterization in the New Testament of the Pharisees to talk about Christian beliefs and practices. So, for example, you might be a Pharisee if, and here are 25 things Christians do, but Jesus would rebuke. I don't recognize Charisma House as a publisher. I do recognize Baker and Zondervan, which are major public publishers of Christian materials. And those also, so accidental Pharisees, avoiding pride, exclusivity, and the other dangers of overzealous faith. So here are 3 examples of the use of the term Pharisee pejoratively. And the one I haven't read these. I've looked at as much as I can online. I read a little bit of them. And the one author even says, I was working with a rabbi in Jerusalem at some council, and I was surprised because he talked about himself as a Pharisee positively. But well, he's a good guy, but I'm going to go ahead and use this term Pharisee negatively anyway. So knowledge of the Jewish view of the Pharisees didn't change his view of whether it's a good term for him to use or not. Won't dwell on that. Whoops. Here we go. All right, so this is the Oxford English Dictionary, definition 1. The Pharisee, a member of a religious party within Judaism between the 2nd century BC and New Testament times, distinguished by its rigorous interpretation and observance of the written Mosaic law, as well as the traditions of the elders. And I think that's a good definition based on what we know about the Pharisees. And the OED chooses, for definition 1, chooses language that is descriptive but not pejorative. So here, I didn't put this on a screen, but here's another dictionary definition that says they're an ancient Jewish sect. That's always a red flag for me, because for a lot of people, being part of a sect is bad, and it's not even clear that that's accurate, that they fit the sociological category of a sect. But anyway, call them an ancient Jewish sect whose strict interpretation of the Mosaic law led to an obsessive concern. All right, so an obsessive concern. So not rigorous interpretation, but an obsessive concern. So there's a definition that I think needs some revision. Here is the OED's second definition. A person of the spirit or character commonly attributed to the Pharisees in the New Testament, a legalist or formalist, a self-righteous person, a hypocrite. So I put these in parallel comments so you can see. So OED, first definition, is a good descriptive definition of the historical Pharisees. The OED 2 is the use of the term, for example, in those book titles or the song. And those characterizations, OED 2 comes from the New Testament. It's under the influence of the New Testament portrayal of the Pharisees. So 2 different interpretations in the OED. Right, so here are our sources. Here's what we don't know a lot. And we know we're certain of less today than we were. So when I probably started my studies, I think what I read about Pharisees in New Testament introductions and books, people were more confident of what was known. And there's there are more questions now. And part of it has to do with looking at not just one source, but all of the sources to see what they have in common. So there's sources from 70, and the 70 is important. Some of you know, I'm sure, as the date when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Judaism and the Jesus movement changed after 70 because many of Jesus followers and Jews were forced out of Jerusalem. The temple, which was one of the I talked about last week, was gone. So Judaism had to change. So that's a sort of an important date in first century Judaism, and also in our understanding of the New Testament and Christian origins. So before 70, we have some information about the Pharisees from the Dead Sea Scrolls and from the Apostle Paul in the New Testament in his letters, one reference. And then after 70, Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, I think I mentioned Josephus last week, also the Gospels and Acts, Book of Acts in the New Testament, and then some early rabbinic writings. I'm not going to talk about the early rabbinic writings at all. I'm really still working through these recent publications myself. So to be honest, I don't know anything about the early rabbinic writings, and I don't know as much as I need to know about some of the other areas. Let's see, what's next? The 5 sources, independent sources, agree that the Pharisees were active in the land of Israel from the time of the Hasmonean kings, so 2nd century BC, to the fall of Jerusalem. And that's the conclusion of William Scott Green, who published a chapter in one of the 2 books that I was using in 2007. His chapter was called "What Do We Really Know About the Pharisees and How Do We Know It?" And that was his conclusion. If we look at all 5 sources, they agree only on this, that they were active in this time period. Now, I'm going to look at Paul first. So Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 3, verse 5, written maybe in the 50s or early 60s, he identifies that he was, regarding Jewish law, a Pharisee. So he identifies with the variety of Judaisms in the first century. Paul says, my tradition, my party was the Pharisees. And then he doesn't use the term Pharisee in Galatians 1, written in the 50s, but this statement that he makes about when he's talking sort of autobiographically, he says, I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. So that fits in with, that seems to fit in with our understanding of the Pharisaic tradition, but he doesn't use the term Pharisee. He only uses it the once. So we don't have a lot. I mean, we have a lot in that Paul says, I was a Pharisee. So we can think of Paul as having been strongly influenced by the Pharisees in the Pharisaic perception, but he doesn't really tell us a lot about the Pharisees. Probably outside of the New Testament, the major sources, a Jewish historian, Roman, named Josephus, Flavius Josephus, born in 37, died somewhere around the year 100. 4 major works: the Jewish War, Jewish Antiquities, a smaller appendix called The Life, and then his last work, written somewhere around right before his death, I think, Against Appian. So here's just a list of the main characteristics we get from Josephus, using Josephus as a source. He talks about there were 3 schools. the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees we know of from the New Testament. The Essenes aren't mentioned. A lot of debate, discussion, and a lot of people think that the Qumran community, those were Essenes, but there's some points of difference between Josephus's description of the Essenes and the Qumran community. So we aren't going to go there today. We aren't going to talk about the Sadducees today. We're going to look at the Pharisees. So it is, but Josephus identifies it as Pharisees as one of the three schools. He talks about them as experts in Jewish law. He talks about them relying on the traditions of the elders. And that by this, it's usually taken to mean that the Pharisees went beyond simply the written law to include oral traditions that were passed down through the elders. So in their expertise in Jewish law included more than what was written. Here's something interesting. Josephus says that the Pharisees, when they applied the law, were lenient, which is not the impression I would get from the New Testament, but they were lenient in their application of the law, in their punishments. He also says that they were really popular among the masses. And sometimes this also conflicts sometimes with some people who say they were the upper crust, or they were, sort of separated from the rest of Jewish society. Josephus says they were really popular among the Jewish masses. And here's a point of agreement with the Jesus movement and with Paul. They believed, now not in Jesus' resurrection, but Judaism had already developed a belief that God would resurrect the faithful, or the faithful and the righteous and the unrighteous. There are different views about resurrection, but there already existed a belief that there would be a resurrection of the dead in the end times and on Judgment Day, if you like that term. This is one point where they disagreed with the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not accept that belief. So this is Josephus. All right, now we're going to look at really quickly at some of the New Testament passages. The Gospel of Mark. Here are 6 points, 6 summary statements. If you look at the Gospel of Mark, what does Mark have to say about the Pharisees? He says these things. They don't eat with sinners and tax collectors. They fast. All right, so those 2 points may be true of more than the Pharisees. And we know from the New Testament that Jesus followers fasted. And there is instruction when you fast in Matthew 6. So these aren't necessarily, the fasting certainly isn't exclusive, and it's not a bad thing unless maybe certain ways of fasting. The next two we get from Mark, disapproving of picking grain and of healing on the Sabbath. I'm going to kind of set those aside. Come back next week. I'm going to talk about the law, and I'm going to talk about the debates between the Pharisees and Jesus over Sabbath law as part of my presentation next week. So I'm not going to talk about those two today. They washed hands before eating, and this is often understood to mean that they took some of the requirements for priests and Levites and said, well, everybody should do that. And this was one of them. Doesn't seem a particularly bad thing, washing hands before eating, even if it's done as a ritual rather than for cleanliness. And then the last one is that they allowed divorce. The New Testament itself, there are passages in which there are exceptions. There are certain cases where divorce is allowed. So the list of Mark's characteristics of the Pharisees is not especially negative about them. It's just different than in some cases from Jesus' own teaching and the Jesus movement. This is, some of you know, when I put Q, that I'm talking about the points of agreement between Luke and Matthew. And so in the passages that scholars identify as Q in Luke and Matthew, so this would not be in Mark. Here are points that are made in that material. The Pharisees wear phylacteries. They attend synagogue. They're called rabbi. They proselytize. They make vows. They tithe. They wash the outside of their dishes, and they know the greatest commandment. So those things aren't also, we could discuss those, but what's interesting, and I guess the point I want to make is, this list is not the same as the list from Mark. That is, even within the New Testament, if you look gospel by gospel, and try to sort out the different views, they don't agree. This would be considered a different source from the Markan source, and they don't overlap. Compared to Mark and Matthew, and I'm not going to talk about John today, but compared to Mark and Matthew, the Gospel of Luke is, I would say, and some scholars would say, more positive, and sort of it's different. There are different evaluations of Luke's view of the Pharisees, but we see Pharisees inviting Jesus to dinner on 3 occasions. We see Pharisees warning Jesus about Herod. They are not associated with priests in Luke's gospel the way they are in, I believe, both Matthew and Mark. They're not sent to trap Jesus in Luke. So if you look at sort of the parallel texts, and they're not mentioned in connection to Jesus' crucifixion, where they are in at least one of the other gospels. So Luke has maybe a more neutral, or at least neutral, maybe even more positive view of the Pharisees. And then the book of Acts. There are really 4 passages where Pharisees are mentioned. And if we look at those 4 passages, what we find from those 4 passages is that they believe in divine providence. That is, they believe that God is directing sort of the sort of history. God is directing, human history. Although they also believe in free will. So it's a combination of divine providence and free will. The Jewish law is important. We see there the resurrection, and this, I think, comes out as a difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, with the Pharisees believing in the possibility of resurrection and the afterlife. And then also there are Pharisees who are part of the group, and this is in Acts 15, who follow Jesus. So there are Pharisees who are still identified as Pharisees who become followers of Jesus. So this is a lot of information, I know, and I think I'm nearly through my lists. This is, so earlier I said, if you're looking for agreement, sort of a common agreement across all 5 sources, all we can say is, yeah, there were Pharisees in this time period. If you look for agreement between 2 sources, you can get a little more information, or a little more points of agreement. And this is not my own conclusion. This is also from the William Green chapter in one of the two books I'll mention. He says, we have testimonies from at least two sources that support these beliefs. So the at least two sources say they differed from the Sadducees and sometimes disputed with the Sadducees. They followed a tradition of the elders in addition to the laws of Moses. That is an independent tradition. It's often referred to, people talk about the oral law. Josephus doesn't use the term oral law, but that's the concept. That is, there are oral traditions that are passed along in addition to the written law of Moses, and they follow that as well. So they're more liberal. They have a broader sense of what is authoritative in terms of following the law. They believed in the resurrection of the dead and in an afterlife, and they practiced this, this is Green's term, Levitical piety outside the temple, meaning they took some of the laws that related to the temple practice and to the priests and the Levites, and they said, we're going to do those too. They shouldn't just be limited to priests and Levites. Okay. Going back to the OED definition 1. A Pharisee was a member of a religious party within Judaism between the 2nd century BC and the New Testament times. This party was distinguished by its rigorous interpretation and observance of the written Mosaic law, as well as the traditions of the elders. And I think that's a good descriptive definition. And it should not lead to the kind of stereotypes of Pharisees as hypocrites, or as, that's the main one, but derogatory terms that we often see used, and we saw in some of the examples I started with. So these are my takeaways. I hope you will take them away from this presentation. Some Pharisees followed Jesus. So Paul was a Pharisee who chose to follow Jesus, who became convinced of Jesus' messianic identity. And there's a group of Pharisees mentioned in Acts 15. So the New Testament, if we read it carefully, gives us a mixed view. And we're often influenced by those sort of outbursts about the Pharisees as hypocrites, to view all Pharisees in that way, without looking more carefully at the other references to Pharisees. I think I would hope that we would avoid derogatory use of the term Pharisee today. To calling someone a Pharisee if what you mean is they're being hypocritical. I would guess that some Pharisees were hypocritical, just as there are some Christians, some Jews today who are hypocritical. I mean, hypocritical is a derogatory use that may have likely applied to some, but not all. It's not a good term for all Pharisees. And some of that language, the more negative language that is used in the New Testament, would be language that in the 1st century was generally used of people or groups that you disagreed with. So it's not saying you're hypocritical because you do this. When you did this, you were a hypocrite. It's just saying you hypocrite, or you're self-righteous. Well, what are you self-righteous about? So they're just the generic terms used thrown up at people that you disagree with without sort of getting into a discussion about how they're being acting self-righteously or hypocritically. I would hope you would all consider appreciating the Pharisees' devotion to the law, even if you disagree with how they applied the law. Or, well, again, I'm going to talk about the law, Jewish law, next week, and you can probably try to give an understanding of Jewish law. So I always think it's important to try to understand first before we evaluate. So appreciate their devotion to the law, even if it's not something, a position you share. So sometimes I find in Bible studies or classes that people really want to talk about the Pharisees. When there are criticisms, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees or other individuals. People want to talk about how terrible Jews were in the first century, or how terrible the Pharisees were, instead of like using the mirror and saying, where do we see that behavior in ourselves? So I think the criticism, if we're applying the New Testament at all, we should relate to ourselves rather than use the Pharisees and others as sort of punching bags to maybe feel better about ourselves. Well, we aren't like they were. And along with that, avoid using the second OED definition, Pharisaical, to mean hypocritical, or to use Pharisees in book titles, sermon titles, songs as shorthand to refer to behaviors among Christians that you want to criticize. And I read, I was looking at a Bible study, an adult Bible study recently, and the author used Pharisees, and she put Pharisees in quotation marks, but to say modern day Pharisees. And I just cringed at that and thought the author should have known better. All right, last slide is just my two sources. I had used the first one, In Quest of the Historical Pharisees. It's a collection of essays by a variety of authors published in 2007. I'd used that earlier for when I gave this presentation at Moundville Church of the Brethren. Then the second one I came across recently and just got my hands on this book, and it's a little thicker and heavier than the first one, but it has a lot of good information. And I'm just now sort of working through that second one by edit, also a collection of essays on the Pharisees, so like the Pharisees in Josephus, the Pharisees in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pharisees in Luke. They're both really excellent books. And I am done. I'm going to stop my share and see what questions you have or what points you want to discuss. And I think I'm seeing in the chat. So 2 questions. We can start with those. What role did the Pharisee party play in the persecution of Christians 35 to 150? And what would be the sources for my answer? Well, it depends a little bit on what you mean by persecution of Christians. As far as I'm not aware of any source that says as a party, as a group, they persecuted Christians. We know that Paul says he persecuted the church, the ecclesia, as a Pharisee. But interestingly, we don't know why. He doesn't really say why. Obviously, he disagreed with the Jesus movement before he became an apostle, before his Damascus Road experience and became an apostle. But he doesn't say why he persecuted Christians. So I would say my sources, I can't think of any source that says the Pharisees as a party persecuted Christians. And my only source would be Paul's letter and Acts, which say he did persecute Jews living in the Roman Empire. They could charge people they could bring charges before the Roman authorities, but Jews didn't have the authority to go beyond punishment within Judaism, if that makes sense. So there's another question before I move on to that one. This came from Frederic. Yes. Did I answer your question sufficiently? Or do you have a different view? And Phil, you can.
Yeah, you answered a bit, yes, but it's quite obscure question, really. So sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Right. Any other comments or questions related to the persecution question? Right. All right. So Julie, if people in the 3rd or 4th centuries looked back on the brethren's, 3rd or 4th millennia is what you meant. Yeah. So in the future, if people look back on the Brethren sect, how would we be seen and how would we want to be seen? Do we look back on the traditions of elders too much, or is that something to be appreciated? I think that's a good question for others to talk about. I mean, I think that's a provocative question about sort of how there are a couple I see a couple of layers in that, but one is I think Julie, do you want to say more about this so that I'm not trying to interpret your question?
Not really. I don't have answers to those. I just think it was intended to be a provocative question.
Okay, and Ellen says coverings and neckties. So I would say my understanding of the Pharisees and of Judaism as it developed into Rabbinic Judaism was always they disagreed on how, like, which, you can read the sources and one rabbi will say this and another rabbi will say that. They disagreed. So the part of the whole tradition is the discussion of, well, should women still be wearing coverings or not? Should men be wearing neckties? And if they wear neckties, what about a red necktie? I don't think so, right? So, I mean, what we see in Judaism, and we see, I'm going to say Judaism because I don't think we have enough information about the Pharisees specifically, but what we see in Judaism is just a lot of debate about which traditions continue to apply and how the written law should be interpreted. And that's something we continue to do today. And sometimes we toss out the older traditions like neckties and head coverings for women. Other traditions we hang on to. Sometimes we go back and look at our older traditions and say, you know what, we've lost that and we want it back. That's just a whole process of negotiation about how we move forward without losing our identity, but maybe shedding some of the aspects of that were important in earlier generations and no longer seem as central. And I would say that's what I understand to be happening in Judaism. And I see Jesus as part of that whole discussion. If we look at Jesus' teachings, this is really, I'm going to say more about this next week. So I don't want to get too far into the whole interpretation of Jewish law. Other comments or questions or thoughts or disagreements? I mean, in the spirit of Judaism, you feel free to disagree with me.
I read the 5 Gospels by the Jesus Seminar years ago. For those who don't recall it, this was where biblical scholars did their own translation of the Gospels and color-coded all the Jesus quotes according to how likely they were to have been said by Jesus. And the criticisms of the Pharisees usually were gray or black. They were not attributed to Jesus by this group. And part of their reasoning, and this is where my memory is a little shaky, I recall that they said that the Pharisees were not that active or prominent in the areas where Jesus was moving during his lifetime, and that these criticisms they attributed more to the New Testament church. Does that fit with your research?
I don't know if John David's willing. He may not be with us. I don't know if John David's willing to say anything on that because he's
posted in the chat, so he's here somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here, but I'm glad for you to take it first.
Okay. Well, I think part of it is so that book was published when so it reflects the views, some of the views that were held about the Pharisees, that the New Testament reflects a controversy that went on in the time of the authors in the late second half, post 70. So they're assuming, Mark, the Gospels were written 70 and later. Jesus died in around 30. So their assumption is that the negative statements about the Pharisees in the Gospels reflect the time of the authors, and they're not directly from Jesus. Is that John David?
I think you're spot on as usual. Yes, the conviction was pretty strong, particularly at the time that book was written, was pretty strong that the Gospels were primarily written not as a historical document to record what happened, but as a tool to help congregations work their way through the struggles that they were having with their own identification of who we are as a people of God, given the differences we have between the emerging rabbinic Judaism on the one hand and the ecclesia on the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thank you. So that's why, if you think back to my slide on the sources, I made 70, put 70 in there. Before 70, so we really don't have sources from the time of Jesus, written sources, possibly Dead Sea Scrolls. But Paul is later than Jesus. The Gospels were written later than Jesus. So that, I think that gets at that question. And John David, you have something in the chat. Given the ambiguity of terms like Judeans and /Jews and Pharisees, what life lesson can we learn about how we choose to read the New Testament? It's also a provocative question. that I don't think I'm going to say invite other people to comment on. I think you can all see this in the chat, can't you? This was written to everyone. Given the ambiguity of terms like Judeans and Jews and Pharisees, what life lesson can we learn about how we choose to read the New Testament? Any thoughts on that?
I guess my immediate reaction is that things are complicated. Life can sometimes be messy. I think it's our tendency to want to make issues and individuals kind of good or bad, black or white. And it doesn't acknowledge the fact that we often live and operate within gray spaces. And perhaps that's because it gives us greater clarity or confidence in our stature, that we're right, or that there's absolutist answers. But I think the critique of there's a sort of some kind of irony that exists here, in that the critique of the Pharisees is kind of what we're critiquing the Pharisees about doing, that they jump to conclusions, or that they that we're really putting them in a box. But that's what we're doing in that definition. So it's a helpful reminder to me that especially as we look back, I think there's a tendency to be like, things were figured out, and you either followed Jesus or you didn't, and there was black and white, and it's just a reminder that the world continues to be complicated and multifaceted, and it's important for us to hold grace and to hold space and to hold curiosity and a willingness to be open to the complexities of life. So I think that's a reminder to me that we tend to want to, I don't know if it's the post-enlightenment or the scientific revolution, we want clear, defined answers about things. And that in and of itself isn't problematic, but sometimes it alters our behavior and how we treat one another, and we need to be kind of self-aware about that.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Jason. I see two other comments in the chat, and I'd invite Naomi. I see what you wrote. We can all see what you wrote, but do you want to say, just want to throw it out there? And then Ellen?
Not really. I don't really have anything to add. I think Jason said essentially the same thing, much better. Just keep a frame of approaching the text with humility and curiosity. And that's what I try to lead my students. I'll be teaching Intro to New Testament again this fall, but also for those of us who go to church every Sunday and feel like we have a good understanding, there's always something more to understand.
And I find it's hard to unlearn what you've learned sometimes. So thinking about teaching undergraduates, my experience was, Naomi, it was easier for students who had no background in Christianity or the Bible to approach the New Testament with curiosity.
Yeah.
And maybe humility. I don't know about the humility, but certainly curiosity.
Yeah.
And with some of the other students, it was tough because I was asking them to unlearn things that had been drilled into them for a long time. And that's hard for any of us to unlearn things that we thought were really true, right? Absolute.
Yeah. A lot of, I'm always surprised at the number of students that take religion courses because they feel like they're going to be easy, because they've been to Catholic school. A number of students come to E-Town from Southern Jersey, and had they been to Catholic school or even locally Christian schools in our area, and they feel like they know it. So this is going to be a breeze. And it's not just factual knowledge. It's deeper than that.
Yeah. Thanks, Naomi. One more comment another comment from the chat. Ellen says, don't judge a whole group on the actions of a few or on just one example. And I think that's very pertinent. And we can think about how that applies in other ways. And this bothers me about I don't know, our society in general has gotten so polarized, and instead of discussing points of disagreement, just simply uses pejorative terms about the other side. So I think that's a good principle to draw from this and apply in a larger sense. We have maybe, I don't know, I know people need to some of you want to get to church, but any other comments or questions or thoughts? You can always email me later.
I'll leave a little space here, but if there isn't any other thoughts or comments, Chris, I'd invite you to offer some parting words to close, but maybe also some words for next week, just to pivot and let us know what we might be talking about next week. But let's see if anyone has anything else to say.
I'm not seeing anything. I hope I didn't put you to sleep. Okay. I think I've said, I mean, I've said I've given you my takeaways, and we've had a little discussion afterwards about how this applies. So I don't know that I need to say anything more about today. Next week, I don't have slides prepared for next week. This is how I'm sort of following the model. I've changed it a little bit as I've retooled this for today, or these 3 sessions. I don't think I'll be using slides. That could change, but I think I'll just have a discussion and try to be a little more just sort of open-ended next week. The topic is Jewish law. And here again, I think there is a lot of negativity that people have about law, Jewish law, misunderstanding. So that's what I'll be talking about next week. I will talk about those texts on the Sabbath law disagreement, because I think that's a great example of how important it is to try to first understand why the opponents have this view about what you can do on the Sabbath and what you can't do on the Sabbath. So I hope you'll all come back next week. I'll try to make it a little maybe slower, less information, more conversation, probably no slides to look at. And if you have questions then from either the first 2 or things that you've been thinking about and building, we can get into that next week. So I'll try to make it a little more discussion oriented and less presentation oriented. That's it, Jason.
All right. Thank you so much once again for taking the time to be with us. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Look forward to having you with us next Sunday. Take care, everyone.
Okay. Bye.